Blood soaked the sterile drapes of forward operating base Chapman. A four-star general was bleeding to death, and his heavily armed aide had his hand on his holster, screaming for a chief surgeon. Instead, a 26-year-old combat nurse stepped up, picked up a Hazhan Zero scalpel, and looked him dead in the eye. The air inside the medical tent at forward operating base, Chapman, was thick, smelling of diesel exhaust, scorched earth, and the sharp, metallic tang of fresh blood. Situated in the volatile Coast Province, near the Afghan-Pakistani border, the base was a constant target. But on this blistering Tuesday in late August, the chaos wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming through the double doors of the trauma bay. First Lieutenant Claire Abernathy wiped a layer of fine brown grit from her protective goggles. At 26, Claire was a trauma nurse in the United States Army Nurse Corps. Her uniform was currently saturated with the blood of a 19-year-old infantryman, and she had spent the last 4 hours in a grueling triage rotation. Outside, a Category 4 haboob, a massive wall of blinding sand, was swallowing the base, dropping visibility to absolute zero, and grounding every Black Hawk helicopter in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. Nobody was flying out. Nobody was flying in. Then, the dreaded mass casualty alarm shrieked over the base's loudspeaker. "Incoming!" yelled Corporal Higgins, bursting through the flaps of the tent. "Convoy hit! Multiple IEDs and a coordinated ambush en route Tampa. It's a bloodbath, Claire. And we've got a massive problem." "We already have a problem, Higgins," Claire shouted over the roar of the wind battering the canvas walls. She pointed to the far corner of the surgical suite. There, Major Samuel Aris, the base's only remaining chief trauma surgeon, was elbow-deep in the open chest cavity of a Special Forces sniper. The backup surgeon, Captain Mitchell, had been reassigned to a forward patrol 2 days prior. "You don't understand," Higgins panted, his face pale beneath the dirt. "It was the command convoy. VIPs. They're bringing in General Gallagher." The name sent a shockwave through the room. General Nicholas Gallagher, of the 82nd Airborne Division, a 4-star general, a legend in the Pentagon, and the man architecting the entire regional counterinsurgency strategy. He wasn't supposed to be outside the wire, but Gallagher was notorious for frontline inspections. Before Claire could even process the information, the heavy doors of the trauma bay blew open. A swarm of armored personnel flooded the room. At the center of the frantic huddle was a gurney, heavily stained with dark arterial red. On it lay General Gallagher. His face, usually a mask of stoic military authority, was entirely drained of color, his skin taking on the sickly, translucent hue of a man rapidly losing his life force. Flanking him was Colonel Richard Hayes. Hayes was a towering, terrifying man. Gallagher's loyal aide-de-camp and a former ranger whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was known theater-wide. Hayes was covered in the general's blood, his eyes wild with a terrifying mix of panic and rage. "Where is the chief of surgery?" Colonel Hayes roared, his voice cutting through the din of the medical tent like a chainsaw. "I need a goddamn surgeon right now. The general is bleeding out." Claire immediately rushed to the gurney, sliding her stethoscope into her ears while her hands expertly flew over Gallagher's mangled body armor, unbuckling and stripping the Kevlar away. "Talk to me, Higgins. What are his vitals?" "BP is tanking, 70/40. Heart rate is 140 and thready," Higgins replied, frantically hooking up the monitors. He took a massive piece of shrapnel to the right upper quadrant, entry wound just below the ribcage, no exit wound. I said, "Where's the surgeon?" Hayes screamed, grabbing Claire by the shoulder and roughly spinning her around. "Get your hands off him and get me a doctor." Claire slapped the colonel's hand away with a ferocity that momentarily stunned him. "Do not touch me in my trauma bay, Colonel. Our chief surgeon is in the middle of a thoracic repair on an active bleeder. If he steps away, that soldier dies. I need to assess the general." "I don't give a damn about a private," Hayes bellowed, stepping directly into Claire's personal space, the veins in his neck bulging. "This is a 4-star general. He commands this entire theater. You get that doctor over here, or I will drag him here myself." "Colonel, stop!" Claire commanded, ignoring his rank. She turned back to the general. She grabbed a portable ultrasound machine, quickly applying the gel and pressing the fast, focused assessment with sonography and trauma probe against Gallagher's abdomen. The black and white screen flickered. Claire's heart dropped into her stomach. The dark pools expanding on the monitor were unmistakable. The shrapnel had torn through Gallagher's abdomen, likely slicing the liver and threatening the inferior vena cava. He was hemorrhaging internally at a catastrophic rate. His abdominal cavity was filling with blood. "He's in grade 4 hypovolemic shock," Claire said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "He has a massive hepatic laceration. He is bleeding to death internally." "Medevac him. Call the birds," Hayes ordered, turning to his comms operator. "Are you blind, Colonel?" Claire snapped, pointing a bloody, gloved finger toward the vibrating walls of the tent. "There is a zero-visibility sandstorm outside. A Black Hawk's rotors would disintegrate in that air. Nobody is flying anywhere." The monitors began to scream. A high-pitched, rapid beeping filled the room. Gallagher's blood pressure had just dropped to 60/30. He was slipping away. "We need to get him into an OR," Claire said. "We need to open him up, find the bleeder, and pack the liver." "Then get Dr. Eris," Hayes demanded, drawing his weapon half an inch from its holster in sheer, irrational desperation. Claire looked across the room. Major Eris was desperately clamping a shredded aorta. He was at least 2 hours away from closing his patient. If Eris stopped now, the young sniper on his table would be dead in 60 seconds. There was no one else. Just a room full of medics, panicked infantrymen, a terrifying colonel, and Claire. Time in a trauma bay does not move in seconds or minutes. It moves in heartbeats. And General Nicholas Gallagher was rapidly running out of them. Claire stared at the monitor. 50/25. She looked at Gallagher's pale, trembling lips. He was slipping into unconsciousness, his brain starved of oxygen. The standard protocol for a combat nurse in this scenario was simple. Administer packed red blood cells, push IV fluids, apply pressure if the wound is external, and wait for a surgeon. But the wound was internal. The fluids were just leaking out of his shredded liver and into his belly. Waiting meant watching a 4-star general die on her gurney. "We have to open him," Claire muttered, almost to herself. "What did you say?" Hayes snapped, leaning in. "I said, we have to open him up right now," Claire repeated, her voice rising, finding an icy authority that made Corporal Higgins pause in his tracks. "Higgins, get him a unit of O- on the rapid infuser. Push a gram of TXA. Prepare a lap tray. Give me a Hashan 0 blade, Kelly clamps, and heavy suction." Higgins blinked, paralyzed. "Lieutenant, we don't have a surgeon." "I know," Claire said, tearing open a sterile gown pack and violently shoving her arms through the sleeves. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Colonel Hayes roared. He stepped between Claire and the surgical tray. "You are a nurse. You are not cutting open a United States general. You will kill him." Claire stopped. She looked at Hayes, the noise of the chaotic tent suddenly fading into a dull, muffled hum in her ears. Nobody in the United States Army knew the truth about First Lieutenant Claire Abernathy. Her file stated she had a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from a mid-tier state school. It was a perfectly crafted lie, buried deep in military bureaucracy. The truth was, 3 years ago, her name wasn't just Claire Abernathy. It was Dr. Claire Abernathy, MD. She had been a rising star, a fiercely brilliant third-year surgical resident at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. She had hands like a concert pianist and a mind that could map the human vascular system with terrifying precision. But the medical world is political, and power protects power. When the chief of surgery, a highly connected, deeply arrogant man named Dr. Robert Henderson, botched a complex bypass on a prominent senator and tried to alter the records to cover his fatal error, Claire had caught him. But Henderson had leverage. Claire's younger brother, afflicted with a rare neurological disease, was receiving experimental, multi-million-dollar treatment at the clinic treatment strictly funded by a grant Henderson controlled. The ultimatum was brutal. Take the fall for the surgical error, lose her medical license, and walk away in disgrace. Or her brother's funding would be cut overnight. Claire had chosen her brother's life over her career. She surrendered her license, packed her bags, and vanished. Desperate for a paycheck, an identity, and a place where her disgraced name wouldn't follow her, she enlisted in the Army under a slightly altered nursing credential, deliberately suppressing her genius to blend into the background. She hadn't held a surgical scalpel in 3 years, but the anatomy of a human being hadn't changed, and right now, the man on the table was bleeding out. "Colonel," Claire said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly even pitch, "General Gallagher is currently bleeding from the portal vein or the hepatic artery. I can tell you this because his abdomen is distended, rigid, and dull to percussion. His systolic pressure is 40. In exactly 4 minutes, his heart will stop. And when it does, no amount of CPR will bring him back, because there will be no blood left in his veins to pump. Hayes stared at her, his jaw tight. I don't care how many medical textbooks you've read, Lieutenant. You are not a surgeon. I am the only chance he has, Claire fired back. Major Eris is elbow deep in another man's chest. If you want to go over there and physically drag the doctor away, thereby murdering a 19-year-old kid to maybe save your general, go ahead. But by the time Eris scrubs in here, Gallagher will be in a body bag. The monitor blared a long, agonizing warning tone. Pressure dropping. 40/20. Higgins! The tray! Claire barked. The young corporal, jolted by the sheer command in her voice, shoved the rolling tray of surgical instruments toward her. Claire reached out. Her fingers hovered over the stainless steel handles. A ghost of a tremor shook her right hand. 3 years of buried trauma, 3 years of suppressed identity fighting to stay hidden. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. She thought of the Mayo Clinic. She thought of her lost career. Then, she opened her eyes, and her hand became a rock. She picked up the Hashon Zero scalpel. The sharp, metallic click of a weapon being unholstered echoed in the tight space. Put it down, Colonel Hayes said. He had drawn his Sig Sauer M17 sidearm. He wasn't pointing it directly at her head, but it was leveled at her chest, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. The safety was off. I am giving you a direct, lawful order, Lieutenant. Step away from the general. You are not authorized to perform surgery. The trauma bay went dead silent. Even the medics working on other patients froze, turning to stare at the unprecedented standoff. A colonel threatening to shoot an army nurse in the middle of a mass cal. Claire didn't flinch. She held the scalpel loosely, professionally, her eyes locked on Hayes's furious face. Shoot me, Claire said softly. Hayes blinked, completely thrown off guard. What? I said, shoot me, Colonel, Claire repeated, her voice dripping with ice. You shoot me right now, and I drop to the floor. And then you get to stand there and watch your general drown in his own blood. You get to explain to the Pentagon, to his wife, and to the President of the United States why Nicholas Gallagher died while you were pointing a gun at the only person in this godforsaken desert who was willing to try and save him. Hayes's hand trembled. He looked at the dying general, then back at the diminutive nurse holding a piece of sharp steel. You don't know what you're doing, Hayes whispered, the rage suddenly giving way to desperation. I know exactly what I'm doing, Claire said, her eyes burning with an intensity that forced Hayes to take a half step back. Now, put the gun away, scrub up, and hold the damn suction tube, Colonel, or get out of my oar. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither of them moved. The wind howled against the canvas. The heart monitor beeped, slower and slower. Slowly, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. Colonel Hayes lowered the weapon. He didn't holster it, but he stepped back, yielding the space. If he dies on that table, Hayes said, his voice a lethal whisper, I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your life in Leavenworth. Noted, Claire said. She turned back to the general. The hesitation was gone. The frightened nurse was dead. Dr. Claire Abernathy had returned. Higgins, Betadine splash. Give me maximum lighting, Claire ordered, her tone sharp, authoritative, and moving at the speed of light. She positioned the scalpel at the base of Gallagher's sternum. Time of incision, 1,400 hours. Making a midline laparotomy. She pressed the blade into the flesh, and the trauma bay erupted into a different kind of chaos. The Hashon Zero blade sliced through the thick dermis and fascia of General Nicholas Gallagher's abdomen with a sickeningly smooth zip. Blood, dark and voluminous, instantly welled up, spilling over the surgical drapes and pooling onto the dirt floor of the tent. Suction! Get in there, Higgins! I can't see a damn thing! Claire shouted, her hands diving straight into the crimson cavity. Corporal Higgins shoved the plastic suction wand into the pooling blood, the machine gurgling violently as it tried to keep up with the catastrophic hemorrhage. Colonel Hayes stood frozen at the head of the bed, his sidearm finally holstered, his eyes wide in absolute horror. He was a combat veteran who had seen men blown apart, but watching a 26-year-old nurse plunge her bare hands into the open torso of a 4-star general was a different kind of terror. His pressure is bottoming out, Higgins yelled, glancing at the monitor. Systolic is in the 30s. Claire, we're losing him. I am clamping the aorta, Claire announced, her voice a flat, robotic monotone of pure concentration. She didn't have time to open his chest. Instead, she pushed her hand deep into the upper abdomen. feeling blindly through the slippery, pulsing mess for the thick, muscular tube of the descending aorta just below the diaphragm. She found it. With brutal force, she clamped her fingers down, compressing the massive vessel against the general's spine. It was a desperate, agonizingly painful maneuver for the practitioner, but it instantly shunted whatever remaining blood Gallagher had left up to his brain and his heart. Pressure is stabilizing. 45/25. Higgins breathed, his voice shaking. But you can't hold that forever. I don't plan to, Claire grunted, her forearm trembling from the immense physical exertion. Colonel Hayes. Hayes snapped to attention. What? Scrub your hands with the betadine on that tray, put on a pair of sterile gloves, and get over here. Now, she barked, stripping away any pretense of military rank. In this 10 by 10 square of canvas, she was the commanding officer. Hayes didn't argue. He doused his hands in the iodine solution, snapped on the latex, and stepped up to the table. Slide your hand down my arm, Claire instructed, her eyes locked on the gaping surgical site. Feel where my fingers are pressing against his spine. You are going to take over clamping the aorta. Squeeze as hard as you can and do not let go, or he dies in seconds. Do you understand me, Richard? Hayes nodded, swallowing hard. He plunged his massive hands into the cavity, tracing Claire's arm until his fingers found the pulsing, thick artery. He squeezed. I've got it, Hayes said, his jaw locked. Freed from the aorta, Claire immediately moved to the liver. The shrapnel, a jagged, fist-sized chunk of oxidized metal from a roadside IED, had sheared through the right lobe. The liver was effectively shattered, weeping blood from 100 microscopic fissures, but the primary culprit was a massive laceration across the hepatic artery. Pringle maneuver, Claire muttered. She shoved 2 fingers into the epiploic foramen, isolating the hepatoduodenal ligament, and pinched it tight, temporarily cutting off the blood supply to the liver. Higgins, give me a heavy needle driver and 3-0 proline. I need to suture this artery, and I have exactly 3 minutes before the liver starts dying of ischemia. Higgins slapped the instrument into her palm. What happened next defied everything Colonel Hayes thought he knew about military medicine. He watched Claire Abernathy's hands move with a speed and fluidity that bordered on the supernatural. There was no hesitation, no shaking, no second-guessing. She threw stitches into the torn artery with the rhythmic, blinding precision of a master weaver. It was an intricate, microscopic ballet, performed in the middle of a screaming sandstorm, inside a blood-soaked tent, under the dim, flickering light of a portable generator. Across the room, Major Samuel Arris had finally stabilized the young sniper. Exhausted and covered in sweat, the chief surgeon peeled off his gloves and turned around, expecting to see the general dead and his nurse standing over a body bag. Instead, he froze. Major Arris walked slowly toward the second trauma bay, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. He looked at the clamped aorta, the perfectly executed Pringle maneuver, and the blindingly fast, flawless vascular suturing happening right in front of him. Lieutenant, Major Arris whispered, stepping up to the table. Where did you learn to throw a continuous running suture like that? Claire didn't look up. I read a book, Major. Are you going to stand there, or are you going to pack this liver with lap sponges so we can get him closed? Arris blinked, completely stunned, but instinct took over. He grabbed the sterile sponges and began tightly packing the shattered liver to control the diffuse bleeding. Artery is repaired, Claire announced, snipping the final thread. She released the ligament. The surgical field held. No fresh arterial blood sprayed into the cavity. Colonel Hayes, slowly release pressure on the aorta. Higgins, push another unit of whole blood. Hayes slowly relaxed his grip. Everyone in the room stared at the monitor. Beat, beat, beat. The numbers on the screen began to climb. 70/40, 85/50, 100/65. General Gallagher's heart rate settled into a steady, strong rhythm. The catastrophic bleeding had stopped. He was alive. Colonel Hayes pulled his blood-soaked hands from the general's chest and staggered backward, collapsing into a folding metal chair. He stared at Claire, breathing heavily, completely devoid of his previous arrogance. Major Arris looked at the surgical field, examining the repair on the hepatic artery. It was flawless. It was the work of a seasoned attending with a decade of fellowship training, not a 26-year-old floor nurse. He looked up at Claire, his eyes filled with profound, unanswerable questions. Who the hell are you, Abernathy? Arris asked quietly. Outside, the roar of the haboob finally began to die down, the wind tapering off into a hollow whistle. Over the radio, a crackling voice announced that the medevac choppers were wheels up and inbound. Claire stripped off her bloody gloves, tossing them into a biohazard bin. She wiped a smear of blood from her forehead, her face completely unreadable. "I'm just a nurse, Major," Claire said, turning her back on the table. "Get him ready for transport." 2 weeks later, the sterile, polished corridors of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland felt like a different universe compared to the grit and blood of Fob Chapman. General Nicholas Gallagher sat up in his hospital bed, a pristine white bandage visible beneath his hospital gown. He had survived the flight to Landstuhl, Germany, and the subsequent transport back to the States. The military surgeons who had opened him up for a follow-up operation had been entirely baffled by what they found. Sitting in the chair beside the bed was Colonel Richard Hayes. He looked distinctly uncomfortable in his Class A uniform. "So, let me get this straight, Richard," General Gallagher said, his voice gravelly but carrying the unmistakable weight of 4-star authority. "The chief of surgery at Walter Reed tells me that whoever did the field repair on my hepatic artery performed a textbook, highly advanced vascular reconstruction. He said it was the work of a master." Hayes swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." He also said Major Eris denied doing it, Gallagher continued, narrowing his steel-gray eyes. Eris put it in his official after-action report. He stated he was operating on a private— "That is correct, sir," Hayes said. "Then who was holding the scalpel, Colonel?" Hayes hesitated for a long moment. He looked down at his polished shoes, remembering the terrifying coldness in Claire's eyes when she told him to shoot her. "It was a nurse, sir," Hayes finally admitted. "First Lieutenant Claire Abernathy. I tried to stop her. I drew my weapon on her, but she refused to stand down. She told me you would die, and she took the blade." Gallagher stared at his aide for a long, silent minute. "A nurse?" "Yes, sir." "Get me my laptop," Gallagher ordered. For the next 48 hours, General Nicholas Gallagher utilized the vast, terrifying intelligence apparatus of the United States military. He didn't just pull Claire Abernathy's service record. He had the Defense Intelligence Agency run a deep background trace on her life before the Army. He pulled tax records, university transcripts, and employment histories. When the file finally crossed his desk, Gallagher read it 3 times. The truth was far more infuriating than the mystery. He read about the Mayo Clinic. He read about the brilliant young resident, the botched surgery by Dr. Robert Henderson, the blackmail involving her brother's experimental treatment, and the forced surrender of her medical license. Gallagher closed the file. His jaw tightened. He picked up the telephone and dialed the Judge Advocate General's JAG office, followed by a direct call to the director of the FBI. "This is General Gallagher," he said into the receiver. "I need a federal investigative task force sent to Rochester, Minnesota, immediately." 3 months later, First Lieutenant Claire Abernathy stood at parade rest inside a sterile briefing room at Fort Bragg. She had been summoned abruptly by the base commander. Her heart pounded a slow, steady rhythm against her ribs. She assumed this was it. The Army had finally figured out she had practiced medicine without a license. She was waiting for the military police to walk in and escort her to Leavenworth, just as Colonel Hayes had promised. The heavy oak door opened. It wasn't the military police. It was General Nicholas Gallagher, walking perfectly upright, followed by Colonel Hayes. Claire immediately snapped to attention, saluting sharply. "General?" Gallagher returned the salute, walking over to the briefing table. He didn't look angry. He looked at her with a profound, quiet reverence. "At ease, Lieutenant," Gallagher said. Claire dropped her arms, but her spine remained rigid. "I have spent the last 3 months catching up on my reading," Gallagher said, pulling a thick manila folder from under his arm and dropping it onto the table. Specifically, federal indictments. "Are you familiar with a Dr. Robert Henderson?" Claire's breath caught in her throat. The color drained from her face. "Sir?" "Dr. Henderson was arrested by federal agents on Tuesday," Gallagher said, smoothly, leaning against the table. "It turns out, when you threaten to cut federal grant money to blackmail a subordinate, you commit severe wire fraud and extortion." The FBI raided his office. They found the original, unedited surgical logs from 3 years ago. The logs that proved he killed that senator, not you. Claire stared at him, her mind completely blank, the walls of the room spinning slightly. I don't understand, sir." "It means," Gallagher said, his voice softening, "that the medical board in Minnesota has received the federal evidence. They have formally expunged your record." Gallagher reached into the folder and pulled out a beautifully embossed piece of heavy parchment. He slid it across the table toward her. Claire looked down. It was a medical license. Valid, active, and reinstated. Printed clearly at the top was the name. Dr. Claire Abernathy, MD. You saved my life, Claire, Gallagher said quietly. You sacrificed your entire future to save your brother, and then you risked federal prison to save a man you didn't even know. That is the definition of a soldier, and it is the definition of a healer. Gallagher stepped back. Colonel Hayes stepped forward. The towering, terrifying man who had once pointed a gun at her chest reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing the Army Commendation Medal with a V device for valor. Colonel Hayes looked her in the eye. It was an honor to hold the aorta for you, Doctor. Tears, hot and unstoppable, finally broke through the iron wall Claire had built around herself for 3 long years. She didn't wipe them away. She looked at the medal, she looked at her medical license, and she finally exhaled a breath she felt she had been holding since she left Minnesota. Dr. Claire Abernathy was back, and she was never hiding again. Sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones forced into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. Claire's story proves that true brilliance and courage cannot be buried forever, even by the most powerful enemies. If you were captivated by this incredible story of bravery, justice, and medical mastery, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life stories.